Hello again, UX folks, and welcome for this episode number 4, which will be about when should you conduct UX research in the product development process. So this episode, I wanted to do it because I have been asked this a lot in my mentorship sessions. So either by UX researchers or by product designers who also conduct UX research, or also some product designers that want to carry a passion project or to enter the field in UX, and they have to carry a passion project for the portfolio. And as such, sometimes they have an inspiration and they want to know, okay, should I go on with design and having my prototype already designed and only then doing some research? So I will go over this question and I will try to answer it as much as I can regarding my own process and my vision of it. So as well as in the other episodes, as a disclaimer, this is my thoughts about this. Again, the UX process and UX research might change in the future. We might do things a bit differently. So what I'm about to tell you now is just to communicate to you my vision and how I do it and how we currently do it among all UX researchers, but it might change, of course. And if you think that some things do not make sense, or if you have your experience that you would like to share, giving some feedback, additional tips, I would be super happy for you to communicate them to me. It would mean a lot, to be honest. And so to do that, I would advise you to go to UX-Change.com. I repeat, it's UX-Change.com. And there you will find some useful links regarding sending me a message, for instance, and also filling out a survey, which would greatly help me to improve this podcast. So now let's begin about when to conduct UX research in the product development process. So we will go into several points. So first of all, when should we conduct it and why? I will go over it. Then about the risks that are inherent regarding if you're not doing it this way, what are the risks? And then why is it so difficult to conduct UX research often in the product development process? Several cases in which you might recognize yourself, why it is not always done this way, and some strategies if you feel that you are not doing the things properly in your mind, just for you to chill out, to relax, because there are always ways to address this. And I will finish with my strategy and also with a bonus tip. To be honest, I didn't think about this before doing this episode. So it's a bonus tip regarding when should you stop doing UX research. Because as UX researchers, we are all passionate with doing UX research, but not everyone conducting research is a UX researcher in essence. Sometimes they are carried out by product managers or product designers. So for various reasons, but they might legitimately ask themselves, when should I stop? When is it mature enough? So I will be answering this as well. And before diving in, I also would like to thank the listeners that are recurrent. I can say in the stats that I have some listeners that are recurrent, and I really want to thank you for the time you take to listen to the podcast until the end. And again, if you want to give some feedback, please head to ux-change.com. It would mean a lot to me. Anyway, let's begin. So, first of all, when should you conduct UX research in the product development lifecycle? Well, as a quick answer, I would say as early and as often as possible. So why early and why often? So first of all, why early? Early, it's because as soon as you conduct UX research we should see UX research as a way to decrease uncertainty when developing a product. So imagine you want to develop a product, let's say an app for people to, I'm thinking about it right now. I have no idea, to be honest, but let's imagine you want to develop an app to help people manage their, let's say, the stress they put on their ear, on their audition. So let's say to be careful with their audition in a day to day. I'm thinking about this right now because I'm a person, I think myself, I'm kind of sensitive regarding noises. I become quickly, let's say, disturbed by noises in the street, the cars, works that are being conducted in the street or in the building, for instance. Or if I have, maybe, I don't know, I'm waiting at the doctor and suddenly there are 3 babies crying. I mean, I know people cannot address that, of course, and no worries. It's just myself, I think I'm sensitive and I need to isolate sometimes when there is too much noise. So then I thought about this idea. So imagine you want to help people to cope with this idea of having too much noise in their environment. So you might think, okay, I know more or less what is the problem. People are encountering too much noise in their environment, and I know already what I'm about to do because in the end I could be a user. So this is a terrible view and mistake. Of course, you're one user, and you might have seen this sometimes in articles or in blog or podcasts or whatever. You are not the end user. So you have to think about this very clearly. You are not the end user. You might have some things in common with your end users, but ultimately, if you build something, it will be for you. And then you want this prototype or this app to work for more people than you, because if you're the only customer, your app will not work. For instance, or if you're serving a business, you cannot think about you as a user because your business naturally is serving many more users than yourself. So this is the first aspect and the first mistake that I see very often. And to be honest, you can be really mature in the UX research discipline and in the product development discipline. I see that every day. Even with senior product managers, I see that. Even with executives, they sometimes have this kind of a saying, which is, oh yeah, but we know that the user would use it this way or that way. Well, wrong. If you do not have evidence, pain points, what is driving the users to behave a certain way, you are running risks. And so that is why I wanted to begin with this. So this is the first, let's say, fallacy. Then why early? Of course, imagine, as I was saying, UX research is here to decrease the uncertainty. So when you develop a product, it costs time and money. And in the end, time is also money. So it costs money. So every little action you will take, be it yourself if you do everything, or if you collaborate with other people, every action you take to develop a product is money. So to be sure that you are on the right track, you have to decrease the uncertainty. And the only way to do that is to conduct UX research. So you might already know the several steps that we have in the product development lifecycle. We have many models and frameworks, but ultimately they are kind of all similar, to be honest. It's not that important. We have a first phase in which we UX researchers advise for running research as much as possible, generative research, when you don't have your product. Because when you run generative research, you will be able to ask your customers about, potential customers, about your problem, their pain points, and so on. And based on that, you will be able to phrase a problem statement. And it's only based on that you will be able then to develop research objectives and research questions and then move forward with the product development lifecycle. So you will move to your understanding phase. So this is when you really define your problem, your, let's say, personas, because you ran research before, and then you know what you should build. So this is what generative research is for. When you don't know what to build and you want to know what the problem is, you run generative research, and then you know, okay, this is the problem. These are my users. They are behaving this way. These are their behaviors, and so on and so on. So then you have something to build upon, because it's super difficult to build something out of the blue, and most of all, super risky. So, okay, this is the first step. You run research for that, to decrease the uncertainty. And so this is at the first step, at the generative point, but then you have other moments. Imagine you know already what to build. Okay, before moving forward, you can run a questionnaire asking your potential customers if you're on the right track, basically. If you would suggest that feature or that feature, let's say, imagine, in our case, we were speaking about decreasing the tension and the stress that people have on their audition, okay? Imagine we're thinking as a product manager, okay, I will develop an app with a map that says, okay, in that city, these are the most nosy area. And that would make sense, maybe, but we don't know. So you have this feature in mind that is a kind of suggested after an ideation session. Well, if you want to make sure if people would value it, maybe you could ask them in a survey. And then if you have a list of features and you see that that feature is the preferred one, for instance, then you would think, okay, we are confident to move forward because people really want this feature. So this is the second thing. When you already have some ideas and you want to move forward and not developing something that in the end will not be useful and will not be used, it will be a complete flop. So this is the second thing. And then when you develop your app, because you already know the features, you kind of begin to develop, you will go through several stages. The wireframe, the low fidelity prototype, let's say mock-up. I'm not a designer, so sometimes I can mix certain words and I'm sorry for that. But overall, this is the main idea. You go from a wireframe, which is something that is non-interactive and even not polished. You don't have any UI. And then you go to a low fidelity prototype. So let's say you have already your screens that make up your flow, but it's not interactive and you do not have the, let's say, visual elements such as text, color, and so on. And then you move to your high fidelity prototype in which you already have your buttons, for instance, you have your gestures, animations, text, color, and so on. And so to be able as well to move at each one of those steps, you will have also to decrease uncertainty more and more. So that is why it's really advised in general to run several usability sessions. So that is my take on this. I would advise to run it as early as possible. And I think, and this is really a hypothesis of mine, I think the earlier you are in the process and the let's say, the most uncertain you are, the more important it is to run research. Because imagine you already have a prototype and you already have some insights on what more or less people would want. Well, maybe if you do not have time, you can skip some steps. It can be possible. I'm not advising for it. I would always advise to run as much research as possible. But if for cost reasons or timing reasons you cannot, if you're later in the process, it's less damaging than earlier. Because earlier, if you do not run any research to identify the problem and you build an app, basically you will be solving the wrong problem with the perfect app. But it's the wrong problem. It doesn't solve anything, so no one will want to use it. So this is really not what you want, to be honest. So this is the first thing, as early as possible. Then often, as I was saying, if you run it often, as research is an iterative process, you will get every time, at every step, closer and closer to the right solution, because you will put your customers in the loop. And so at every moment, you will have your customers saying to you, no, this is right, this is wrong, I want this, I don't want this. And sorry, here, wanting is not the word, and we should not take a customer saying, I want this as a face value. It's more complicated than that, because we also have the business in mind. But you get the idea. It's the idea that when you ask from your customers their, let's say, pain points, needs, expectations, and so on, as often as possible, you limit the risk of being wrong. And so, up to now, I didn't say what could be the risk, basically. So imagine, okay, you have your first idea because you run generative research. And so you think, okay, I will put this feature, this feature, this feature. And then you think, okay, let's run a prototype. So this is a very common scenario. People do generative research first, and then they go straight into building the prototype, high fidelity prototype. This is something I saw really often. And then when you launch, sometimes I even see people launching things before doing usability studies. Well, you see, it makes a complete flop. And usually it's not because the idea is wrong. It's not because it's the wrong problem, because you identify the problem and it's okay. But it's because there is a complete world between identifying the right problem and being with the wrong solution. This can happen as well. And so this scenario, I'm taking this because, as an example, because in my mind it's the most common. Well, you went from finding a solution to having a full high fidelity prototype. Just imagine the people you involved in this. Imagine the time it took. And imagine, so indirectly, the money it took you, first of all. And then imagine that all of that, you have to go backwards because your customers are giving you some feedback saying, this is not working, I'm not finding this option, I do not understand that, this copy is misleading, and so on, and so on, and so on. So you have to go back. And going back from a complex prototype will be super difficult for a lot of reasons. Because you will have to deconstruct, and you will have to go back, and sometimes when you run research in a high fidelity prototype, you will only find the answers to the questions you asked. So if you ask questions related to your high fidelity prototype, how can I say, it will be difficult for you to identify what went wrong up in the funnel. So in my opinion, it's not only doubling the time and the money required, it's more than that. And it's difficult to measure that. It's difficult because then you will also be, and this is something that you identify very often, you will also be kind of in love with your solution. And your software developers will be in love with the solution, your designers as well, your UX writers as well, So you do not want that. This is the second reason, as often as possible. So these are the risks. Also, I covered this. And so now about the second point. The problem is it's not always done this way. Let's face it. Running research as early and as often as possible is oftentimes not, let's say, done. And for several reasons, because as researchers and as designers, data analysts and so on, we all know there is the theory and there is the application of that. And in the real life, in the real world, things are really, let's say, optimal, because you can have limitations on a budget, you can have limitations in time, you can have limitations in resources, and all of that will contribute to the fact that it will be difficult for you to make it optimal. And on the research side, that means affecting the quality of research and potentially the frequency of doing research and the stage at which you run research. So we have to be mindful of that. It can happen. For those who don't know, I thought it could be still interesting to mention when can this go wrong, basically, when you would in the real life not be able to run research properly. So imagine you work at a company that is not fully user-centered. And I mean, bear my word here, really, it's more often the case than not. To be honest, I do not have an extensive career. I only have 8 years of practice as a UX researcher. But to be honest, I would say that in more than half of my career, I saw this. And even in companies who claim themselves to be user-centered, we see behaviors of not being user-centered a lot. It doesn't mean you have to only take into account the user, because this would not be a viable solution. And when we develop a prototype, we have several elements to take into account, such as the usability, such as how much it answers user needs, but also the viability of an option and of a solution. And this takes a lot of business into account. So I'm not saying here again to only listen to the customer. There is also the business side of it, and this is super important as well. But as I was saying, you can be working at a company that is not fully user-centered. And again, this can be due to several reasons, such as your stakeholders thinking they are the users. So for instance, I'm not blaming anyone because this is something that is very frequent. But for instance, in the automotive company, this is something that is really, really present. And I've done several, so that's why I'm saying I'm not blaming anyone. I've done several automotive companies. And yeah, since we are all users of a car at some point, we are all, let's say, led to think, oh yeah, but I know this use case is not that common, or this solution will not work because I can imagine myself driving my car and I will not use this. This is something that happens. And in this case, you should always have in mind, in my opinion, and if you have other solutions, please tell me, but you should always have in mind, you are not the user. It's difficult for you to gauge how many users think like you and how many don't. And maybe there are more users that do not think like you and who would be a customer and a user of a competing solution you're not thinking about. So it's super important to have this in mind at every time. So I would say that, and also what I say to my stakeholders is, okay, you're thinking you're the user, you're thinking this solution would be great. Okay, well, no worries. We can go on and trust your gut. No worries. But let's have in mind two things actually. The first one is how can you kind of give me a value of how much it will cost to develop your solution? Give me that in terms of time, in terms of let's say collaborators, and let's say in terms of material, the material value. So let's have this in mind. And then what is the cost of running research? And oftentimes, to be honest, running research is way less expensive than developing the whole feature. And then what is the risk if you're wrong? In terms of money, how much will you be wasting? How much will you be wasting if you do not run research? And how much will you be wasting if the solution is wrong and you have to do a rollback and design again and do the process all over again? So, and this has always worked for me, to be honest. When I took my stakeholders in the eyes and I said, okay, just let's have this in mind. And yeah, it works because you're talking money, you're talking time, you're talking risks. So yeah, this is what I would say. Then a second option, a second scenario that could happen why you would not be able to run research at all the steps. It could be that you arrive late on a project. Basically, imagine you arrive and you have the designer who already worked on a solution. Well, of course, here it's not your fault. It's no one's fault. It's the way things are done, and multiple things are to be considered here. So this is also the work of a UX researcher, is to be able to adapt the circumstances and sometimes suboptimal circumstances. So in this case, what I would say is it happened to me in the past several times. So it would be to imagine you have your prototype ready, but the stakeholders didn't run generative research first. I'm not sure. I think I may have spoken about this solution in another episode of the podcast. But what I do in general is basically combining some usability study and some generative research. So if you have time, you could also do only generative research to see if you're on the right track. But to be honest, for several reasons, it might not make sense. First of all, because your stakeholders might think, okay, we already have a solution, we are wasting time by going backwards in the research process. And so it might be difficult for you to advocate for doing generative research when you already have a prototype. So this is something that would be difficult. The second thing is it would be highly unlikely that they develop the prototype without any assumption and without any rationale, even if they didn't speak to any user. And again, this might go quite in contradiction to what I said in the first part, to always run generative research first with users. But if they didn't do it, at least they would have some data, some business metrics, some maybe competitor analysis, which would kind of be some elements for them to think they're on the right track. I'm not saying it's optimal, but at least you have something. And so I would advise you to at least do some desk research, interview your stakeholders at this point, so designers, product managers, data analysts, to at least understand what was the rationale behind the design of this prototype. And so once you have that, you can build your hypotheses and your research questions. And this is super important. So I arrived on projects in the past and the prototype was already done. So I thought, okay, but for me to understand what's going on, I need you to tell me, why did you do the prototype this way, basically? What led you? Did you do research before? And if so, what type of research? Why is this flow this way? Why do you have 3 steps? Why do you have the button, I don't know, in the up left corner? Like, ask everything you should ask. And if they don't have answers, well, then you know this is an assumption and it should be still verified. And if they have answers, well, if this is backed up by research, okay, this is also good because you don't ask the same question twice and you do not waste time. So this is what I would do. And as I was saying, I would run a kind of research which would be a mix of methods, basically. So first, I would have a first part of an interview with my customers with really generative research questions, such as, please tell me about a typical day in which you felt, for instance, that you had troubles with your audition because of the noise outside. I don't know, something like this. Tell me what happened first, and then what happened? What did you do, and why? You know, these kind of questions, even if you already have a prototype, because you will still be able to produce some deliverables in UX that would be reusable over time, such as a user journey. This is of high value. It can also be reused later, such as personas as well. Maybe your stakeholders developed a prototype with one persona in mind, but maybe it's not the dominant, you know? So this would be what I would do. And then in the second part, of course, since it is the objective, you would test the prototype with, of course, a moderated usability test. This is what I would do here. Of course, it depends on the specific of your research question, but in general, this is what I would do. And so in this case, the, let's say, other aspects that I wanted to talk about was what is my strategy in these cases when you face these 2 scenarios, when you work at a company that is not fully user-centered and when you arrive late on a project. In these 2 scenarios, you can have one common solution that will be difficult to implement, might be difficult to implement, but it's still worth a try. In my opinion, it's about evangelizing. And I'm not saying here about teaching designers how to do research and so on. It can be one way to do so, but evangelizing is the way to go. Explaining, no, it's not the word, but kind of educating stakeholders on why it's important to do research. As I said in this podcast, early and often. Why? And you can have several elements that I mentioned that you can reuse yourself. such as decreasing the uncertainty. Uncertainty is really risky because if you solve the wrong problem with an amazing solution, it's useless. So this is the first thing. Then, because you would waste time and money, and when I say time, multiply this time by the number of stakeholders that are working in your project, it can be super high. So if you mention that in your presentation or in your documents or in your conversations with your stakeholders, then they might listen to you because you're speaking in a language that interests them. You're speaking about saving about costs, saving on time, and implementing some processes to be sure that you're on the right track. So this would be my take. And before finishing this episode, I wanted to address the bonus part, when to stop conducting UX research. You might ask yourself, if you're not a UX researcher, and even if you're one, and it's completely legitimate, I ask myself this question oftentimes, when should I stop? Because, there is this phenomenon called analysis paralysis that could be a kind of interesting analogy. So when you try to develop a product or when you try to act on something and you read too much, you read too many articles or too many books or too many feedback on forums or whatever. So when you know too much, sometimes you think, okay, no, this will never work, or I should not do this way. Or first I should read about this book and then about this book and then I should act. Or no, I should do one more research in our case. And I will not be the one dissuading you to do research as a UX researcher, and as I said, as early and as often as possible. But we should also have in mind, and this is true, research is good to be conducted when it is useful. It's as everything. Maybe you're listening to this and maybe you're a software developer. I mean, I'm sure I will not be wrong if I'm telling you, okay, build this feature, and you're asking me why, and I'm saying sorry because I say so, but this feature is useless. You would tell me the same. If it's useless, why would I be doing it? That convince me that it's useful. And this part of convincing me that it's useful is called maybe the research plan, stakeholders interviews, and so on. So in your company, you would have a taste of when research should be more or less stopped at some point and when, for instance, you should launch your product. But I can give you some hints that can help you. So for instance, the gold standard, I would say for me, at least in my case, would be to run generative research to identify a problem. Once I have a problem, I ideate, I come up with solutions, and then I launch a kind of questionnaire to gauge how much these solutions would be adopted, more or less, or some kind of validation technique. Then I collaborate with my designer and we begin to design basically about the wireframes and low fidelity prototypes. And here at this step, I would run a moderated usability study. When you have a lo-fi prototype, so maybe with some kind of first interactions, of course. So for instance, no image, no text, no icons, or maybe a minimal amount, But here it would be useful because here you're not testing the finished prototype. You're testing the idea. You're testing the solution. You're testing, you have done that before with the questionnaire, but you're testing more, let's say, the flow. So more or less that. And then I would finish by iterating and having a high fidelity prototype. And then it's up to you. To be honest, it's up to you. I would do either moderated or, to be honest, the best would be the moderated part to still gather some insights. But it's maybe more expensive in terms of time because you have to run the interviews. And then on top of that, I would do a non-moderated to validate with a high number of participants. This is what I would do. But, if you're short on time, maybe skip the moderated part because if you have many maybe a lot of insights, you will have to redesign something. And this pushes the launch of your product. So maybe a non-moderated, and then you launch your product. This is the minimum viable research, MVR. So I just came up with an acronym. I honestly do not know if that exists, but for me, the minimum viable research would be generative, and then first maybe a survey to validate, and then first a moderated usability study, and then a non-moderated usability study. And that is it for the episode of today. I'm really happy that you're listening to it. I really value the listeners and your time and your trust. And please, if you like this podcast, subscribe to it, rate it. Please, that would really help me to having a little bit more of visibility. And also, please share it with your friends, with your colleagues, and everyone that might be interested in the podcast. And finally, if you want to give some comments, some feedback on the podcast, I know the platforms we use every day are kind of difficult to interact. I mean, it's even not possible to my knowledge. Maybe I'm wrong, but I'm myself a user of podcasts platforms, and sometimes I'm like, what is going on with the usability of this platform? So I know how it is, but if you want to give some comment, feedback, or if you want to appear in the podcast, please contact me through UX-change.com. I repeat, it's UX-change.com. And yeah, basically, thank you for listening, and see you in the next episode. Have a nice day.